Hank Paulson is the chairman of the Paulson Institute, former Treasury Secretary of the United States, and of course the former CEO of Goldman Sachs. Hank, you delivered a speech here this morning at the New Economy Forum that I would describe as fiery and in some respects surprising. I say surprising because you came down hard on China, harder than many people expected. Why?
Well, I said things publicly that I've been saying in private to China for a long time. And the reason I came down quite hard is because I really believe that the trade and investment, as we've known it, are apt to change significantly. And, you know, I see the real prospect of an economic iron curtain where we have both sides throw up walls and unmake the global economy as we know it if they don't move faster to open up their economy to trade and investment.
When you use that term, economic iron curtain, you're hearkening back to the days of the Cold War and the kind of divide, cultural, economic, military, that separated the United States from the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and we're not in a Cold War now. People that say it's a Cold War, it's overblown. But we have the very real threat of a Cold War if we continue down this trajectory. It's a dangerous trajectory. And what I see happening is I see a growing consensus in Washington that China is no longer just a strategic competitor, but in danger of becoming a strategic adversary.
And you don't see the risk that China would be a strategic adversary?
Yeah, I see the very real risk. I see the risk. I see that trajectory. And I see...
but a trajectory that the United States may help to drive as opposed to China driving it on its own.
Yeah, well, they're both. I talked about both the United States and China. And with China, you know, there's clearly they need to move much, much quicker. And
specifically on what?
Yeah, first of all, opening up their economy. So here we are. You know, the United States was critically important in helping China accede to WTO membership. And now, 17 years later, they still haven't opened up in so many areas. And we're talking about a $13 trillion powerhouse. And so this is a situation where many U.S. companies have given up hope. I've seen U.S. businesses go from being an advocate of U.S. policy to being a skeptic and now actually being opponents of U.S. policy.
Hank, you've been to China more than 100 times, am I correct?
Yep.
You're good friends with the Vice President, Wang Qishan.
Absolutely.
So you must have some insight as to why the Chinese are reluctant, if not opposed entirely to this notion that they should bring down their investment barriers, eliminate non-tariff obstacles to investment in trade. Tell me why. What have you learned? Why is it that they were, and what motivated you to actually come out and say these things publicly?
Well, what clearly motivated me is I see a dangerous trajectory. And so I look at this relationship between the U.S. and China as by far the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world today. I think it's going to shape the geopolitical landscape we live in. And so I'm looking at a situation where I see that if we can't hammer out some consensus, that I see a huge systemic risk, a real systemic risk. An international order is just too big to fail. That's unacceptable. We need a new strategic framework. And so, again, what I see, there was the belief, there was the hope that economic linkages would help mitigate security competition. And now you see security competition is intensified. It is bled into business and economics, and so there's a whole series of behaviors there. But as you said, on the U.S. side, I'm also gravely concerned because I'm concerned that our attempts to isolate China may lead to self-isolation, because I don't believe there are many other countries, if any, that are going to attempt to divorce themselves or want to divorce themselves from an economy like China's that is so big and growing so quickly.
It's good, Hank, that you're offering constructive suggestions.
Right.
That's what the situation requires right now,
right.
Both for the Chinese and for the United States. Let's talk about the United States for a moment.
Yeah.
You want the United States to tone down the rhetoric. Those are the terms that you used. What's the likelihood of that happening when the sitting president sees painting China as an enemy as so politically advantageous?
Well, what I said, if you listened carefully to the speech, is I'm not particularly optimistic in the short term about the trajectory. So what I see is really a long winter of U.S.-China relations. I think the spring is going to come. I think it's going to be a patchy spring, and I think the reason the spring is going to come is, I think, and it's going to take statesmanship on both sides. I think both sides are going to see the alternative is unacceptable. The alternative is absolutely, we can't, the global order is just simply too big to fail. It's just too important to each country.
There is talk now, spurred by President Trump, of a deal. Do you have any idea what the Chinese would find acceptable, and do the Chinese have any idea what the president wants?
Well, let's sort of talk about the tariff impasse, okay? Because that's eventually going to come to an end. And as a matter of fact, I am more optimistic than many. I'm more optimistic that China is willing to agree to enough of what President Trump wants that he could agree to something and do it with honor if it was a first step in negotiating a high standard investment treaty or trade agreement. But I think
he has to believe that the Chinese are willing to follow through.
Yes, but I think so. I think despite that, and despite the fact that I think that no one wins a tariff war. The business that wants us to be more aggressive, the business community doesn't want a tariff war. So, the tariff war is going to end. And when it ends, we'll be grateful for a small victory.
Because I see, but that doesn't end the winter, in other words.
No, we need some small victories. But even in the economic areas, the differences are so wide and so deep, it's going to take, it's not going to end quickly.
You mentioned at the outset of our conversation.
So it's possible to be optimistic about the tariff war ending and say...
And realistic about everything else.
And realistic that the economic tensions will still be there for some time. But I will take the small victories because small victories will help begin building some confidence.
You mentioned at the outset of our conversation that you gave this fiery speech because you've been saying these things in private and it was time to say them in public. Do you have any reason to believe that now you're public, your friends in China will listen to you more?
Listen, as I said, I think these are festering, difficult, long-term issues. I am optimistic, as I said, over the longer term that we're going to find some workable solution. But many of these are structural issues. And what I explained to leaders in China when I speak to them is there is a growing consensus. Policy leaders in Washington, it's not just the Trump administration, it's uniting Democrats and Republicans.
Right.
That China's rise has come at the expense of the United States. That they are increasingly an adversary. And so the thing that I'm saying to the U.S. side is I'm saying, okay, tone down the rhetoric. China is not an existential threat. Get it? This is the 242nd year of our democracy. We need to have more faith in our system. We can meet the China challenge and not back away from the values that will let us become the most admired country in the world, the largest, most competitive economy. And there's the whole series of things we need to do with China. But most importantly is fix our own problems, invest in America. Strong military, strong economy, our alliances, education system, all those things.
Hank, I want to thank you very much. An optimistic note to end our conversation.